Hi again, everyone. Welcome back. Our next presentation is on the analytics tools in your digital marketing toolbox, led by mStoner's Greg Zaguda, our Assistant Director of Technology. See, the beauty of digital marketing is that everything's measurable, right? So for the next hour, Greg is going to talk about a number of analytics tools, how they fit into your digital marketing strategy, how you can ensure maximum ROI by using them. Greg Zaguda plays a key role in delivering the technical rigor and expansive capabilities for which mStoner is known. Greg is Google Analytics certified and involved at every step of our client projects to ensure that all the pieces are fitting together and functioning elegantly. Greg, I'm so glad that you could join us today. Let's get started.
All right. Thanks, Mallory. Hi, everybody. It's good to talk to you today about analytics. I know at least a few of you I think I've spoken with before in settings like this. So hopefully there's some new things of value here today. As Mallory mentioned, I do a lot of work with our clients on web analytics on their projects, in addition to and along with the work we do on website redesigns and content management system implementations and integrations, search and social and all the things that go along with it, the technical nuts and bolts of launching websites. So as has come up a number of times today, analytics is part of a lot of the different pieces that we've been talking about. And so by way of agenda for today, I wanted to talk about a few different topics around analytics and measurement and some of the tools that are fundamental to the efforts that we have in digital marketing. But it wouldn't be right to have a day like today without talking about these in a little bit more detail. So I expect there'll be some things that are not at all new to you. I hope there's maybe some gaps that we can fill, and then maybe some new things that come up along the way. So I want to start off talking about Google Analytics, kind of table stakes for everybody in measuring your web analytics. I want to spend a little time talking about Google Tag Manager, kind of what its role is, what it does, and some of the ways that we can use it without taking too deep a dive. Then I want to touch on A/B testing and experiments. I know those have come up a couple times already today. And then finally, I want to talk about dashboards and reporting and round things out with some ways that we can approach solving that part of the equation. So we've got all this data, and what are we going to do with it? In 2017, I've been thinking about something that relates to this quote from Charles Babbage, and he was an English mathematician and computer scientist of a few years ago. But he said something like, errors using inadequate data are much less than those using no data at all. And this relates to what I've been thinking about this year around not letting perfect be the enemy of good. And that's something that applies to the work that we do with colleges and universities in analytics, and that I see some of the institutions doing as well. That everybody's got this Google Analytics data. We have data from other sources. We kind of get the idea of measuring and what we want to do with it. It's really hard to do really well. People don't have a lot of staff. People don't have a lot of time for this. Sometimes there's gaps in expertise. And so one of the big takeaways I want you to have from this discussion today is that you have some of these tools, and we'll talk about how some of them are working for people, but not letting the idea of a perfect solution get in the way of making some use of these things. So while inaccurate data is bad, imperfect data or inadequate data can still be okay. We can still get some things out of it. And in fact, turning these things into a part of our process involves, asking questions, getting some answers, and then getting more questions. So it is a cycle of always needing some data, and it's never really going to be perfect. So with that in mind, let's start talking with Google Analytics. We can't ignore it. There are three areas I want to touch on today, mainly because these are the areas that I think you're most likely to get value out of with digital marketing, and they require additional setup and configuration and thinking, aside from just putting Google Analytics on your site, which I trust everyone here is probably already doing. So first of those would be goals. So conversions are fundamental to digital marketing. We've talked about them in a few different areas already. Campaigns, and specifically Google Analytics campaigns, tagging URLs. James mentioned this earlier. We'll circle back to that. And then segments, so how we report on data and narrow our audiences, because we know we have tons of audiences in higher ed, and that's a challenge on our websites with anonymous visitors to get a better idea who is doing what and what some of the more important folks are doing in terms of our marketing efforts. So I mentioned it a couple times already, but everyone has Google Analytics. You know, I see this struggle with folks over and over again, that, you know, we struggle with small teams with limited time. We have this data. It's hard to make it useful and get something out of it. And increasingly, I think we find that Google Analytics is only part of the data that you need when you're talking about digital marketing and you've got landing pages and digital advertising and social. Not all those things are going to be reflected in Google Analytics, but it's definitely an important piece of the puzzle, so we can't ignore it. So we'll talk about a few of the other tools in addition to Google Analytics and how they're necessary, and see if we can't break down and give you some tools to break down some of those silos where data gets tied to different separate digital marketing efforts and doesn't get all pulled together. Starting with goals. I probably preaching to the choir, I hope I am, about the need for goals in Google Analytics and measuring conversions. But, you know, to start on the ground floor here, effective goals need to tie back to business objectives. So when we create Google Analytics goals, we're creating something that ties to a business objective. You know, they're marketing things that we're doing to try and, you know, drive enrollment or giving or what have you. And there are specific tasks that we want to get visitors to take, and those are what we want to focus on for goals. Goals are important, and one of the things I want to stress today is that they unlock additional insight in Google Analytics. So we are, I think, all used to going into Google Analytics and getting a view of how much traffic comes to your website, how many sessions, how many page views, those sorts of things, which have some value in certain times. But there are definitely reports and sections of reports within Google Analytics that just aren't valuable. There's nothing in them. You're not going to be able to use them without setting up conversions. And I think there are lots of starts and stops with this. So I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with this. Maybe you have some goals set up. What I see happen often are there are goals set up. The way that Google Analytics works, of course, is you can't ever delete goals. You can only turn them off, you know, from a view in your Google Analytics. And so then there are a lot of questions about whether or not these are valuable. Are these still measuring what we thought they were measuring? Someone else set them up, but then they left or moved on to some other part of the institution. So it's important to circle back to this and then try and coordinate the goals we have on the website with other marketing activities that are happening, whether it's digital advertising or other things that may drive visitors to the website. And then we want to be able to see, okay, we had this marketing activity we're maybe measuring separately, but also see how that impacts the website a little bit more. So goals, measuring things that matter, helping us make decisions. So a refresher on creating goals. You do this in the Google Analytics administrative area. So again, it has to be done intentionally to add to your Google Analytics. And each view has its own goals. So another thing I see people do is create goals, but then they end up in, you know, not the place where people are doing most of the reporting. For example, maybe you have a view set up for admissions. You create goals in that area because admissions has some goals around request information or campus visits. But then a lot of reporting is happening in other views that don't have those goals. And so people either don't see them or don't take advantage of them because they're not there. So it's, you know, simple to do, but kind of fundamental to have in place. I still see when working with folks on creating goals that destination and event goals are the most useful. So I've got all the different types of goals on the slide here. I still would stress destination and event goals as the ones that are most helpful to what you're trying to measure with different digital advertising or digital marketing things we're talking about today. A few of the reporting areas where you'll see these conversions show up and why this is important. I want to kind of hammer that home a little bit. So this first report is the goals overview. If you set up goals, you've probably looked at this. It shows you how many conversions you have across all goals. You can break it down to individual goals, what the value is if you've assigned it, conversion rate, the basic stuff that a conversion in Google Analytics gives you in terms of data. So of course, this is data you don't have if you don't have goals set up. But this is really just the start. There's some other places you can learn some interesting things if you have the conversion set up. The first of those I wanted to talk about is this time lag report. And the one I'm looking at here is just an example of a virtual tour visit goal set up for an institution. So this time period has 158 conversions on that goal. And the time lag report shows us the gap between the original session and the goal conversion. So how long does it take people from the first time they visit to complete this goal? And this might tie back to interactions you have mapped out on your experience map that Shannon was talking about and was talked about earlier today as well. So if we know that a virtual tour is part of that experience map, we may have some assumptions about what that journey is like for a visitor, coming back to our site, exploring information about programs, about admissions and financial aid, campus visits. Maybe they do that more after they've been admitted. So this matters at different time periods. But this is a way for you to see a little bit more about how particular conversions of interest happen and kind of true that up with what we think they're doing, right? So if we create an experience map, we might value some of this information in creating that and also refining it. When do we want or expect visitors to take these steps in the admissions funnel? And then how are they actually doing it, right? And this applies to any conversion you set up. Another example of a report that you'd have access to with your conversion data is the goal flow report. So this is a nice visual way of taking a dimension. Right now I'm looking at this virtual tour visits by region. So region being state in Google Analytics. So I've got a certain number of visits from California, from Colorado, et cetera. And how does that match with the goals we have around admissions for these different areas and the other activities that might be driving people, whether it's email or high school visits and things like that might send prospective students to come look at a virtual tour. So you can use this in a few different ways and get a nice visual representation of what's going on. And I think a couple of those reports are kind of quick hits. You might look at them and explore some things. You don't have to take a deep dive or spend hours analyzing it. And then the last area I want to show you as an example of the ways that I think people miss the opportunity on conversions is the channels report here, where we're looking at traffic that came to the site, from our different channel groupings. So organic search, referrals, social, all those sorts of things. But the right third of the report, where the arrow is pointing, is all related to conversions, where we can select a conversion and then see how conversions differ across those channel groupings. And of course, you could drill into the channel groupings and look at different referral sources, different social outlets, those sorts of things. So I think there's a missed opportunity here for a lot of folks where we either have goals set up, but we're not looking at them in the right spot, or we aren't taking advantage of this part of the report. So take advantage of your goals, set those up, and unlock some of these other reporting areas that might be useful to you. What are people measuring in higher ed? What are the things that people set up as goals? What should people be measuring? I mean, the answer always varies from one institution to another and within different units within an institution. But these are kind of top to bottom the things that, working with a few dozen different institutions, I see them tracking. Requests for information, whether it's graduate, undergraduate, sometimes there are a number of flavors of this for an institution. Sometimes there's just one, one process, one form, but those are usually highly valuable. Campus visits, contacting a counselor, and application, admissions funnel related stuff is always important. But then there's some other areas like, giving and purchase of tickets or registering for events and so forth. So there are a lot of opportunities to set, some goals using those event and destination goals, and then start to unlock some of the different reporting areas. So goals is the first area of Google Analytics that makes sense to sharpen your pencil on a little bit if you haven't had a chance to do so. Next area I want to talk about is campaigns. So for campaign tracking, we're talking about creating campaigns within Google Analytics. So we've got campaign tagging that goes on to URLs that drive data into Google Analytics. And then you have data show up reports using campaigns that come from these external activities you're doing. So again, it requires some intentional configuration and setup, not actually within Google Analytics, but within the URLs that you're creating. And this really is the link, and James talked about this a little bit earlier today, between things like digital advertising and then, we measure conversions with your advertising platform, but then what are those people doing when they get to the website? So you may have a conversion on an ad to get somebody to, to a landing page or something like that, but then those visitors are going to take other actions on your website, and they may convert on other goals that you've set up on your website, and campaigns are what's going to connect the dots. So I think a focus for people here, I think most people, if they look in Google Analytics, whether you're intentional about it or not, you've got some data for campaign tracking in place, because a lot of email newsletter software and things like that will automatically tag campaigns for you, certainly digital ads and things like that. But if you're intentional about organizing how you label campaigns and what they mean, it makes the data more valuable. I know James showed you the Google URL Builder, which is what you use to create campaign URLs and attach those UTM variables to make those long query strings. But that's definitely a worthwhile effort, and it takes, it's not a heavy lift, but it takes consistency. And I think that the use of a spreadsheet to track campaigns, what they're tracking, when they're launched, who owns them, this is another area where we have silos, where lots of folks may share, the same Google Analytics account across an institution, but different units may be doing different things that generate campaign data. And all that's going to show up together in the report that I'll show you on the next screen. But it's hard to make sense of that if we don't know what that is, or if one area doesn't know what another area is doing. So there's a really good opportunity to take advantage of the things that people are already doing, marketing that they're doing, and just understand what it is, so that when you dig into Google Analytics, you can make sense of it. If you look at this slide, these labels for the campaign, this is the campaign report in Google Analytics, are difficult to decipher labels that are getting automatically generated. But with a spreadsheet that interprets those or renames those, to something more useful when they're created, is a way to make this more valuable. And again, when we look at campaigns, similar to some of the other reports we looked at, we've got our conversions linked in. So if we're doing campaigns that are, digital advertising, and we've got separate data that's reported on, on the performance of those ads, we still have an opportunity to look at what other goals, other conversions that are configured on the website, those visitors may participate in. And so, these things go hand in hand, the campaigns and the conversions, the goals. So my big takeaway with campaigns is to encourage you to organize them and be intentional about them, and use that to your advantage in your digital marketing. The last area of Google Analytics I want to talk about before we move on to some other topics are segments. And segments are something we use for reporting. So you apply them to a report within Google Analytics when you're viewing data. And they're really powerful for creating smaller slices of audiences based on different criteria, almost any criteria that exist that are being collected by Google Analytics. They apply to historic data. So if you've created views before, you may know that if you create a view, it doesn't have any prior data in it, even though you may have that elsewhere in your account. And if you apply a filter to a view, that data is permanently absent from the view. But with segments, they don't alter the data. They just filter it for your view, and you can carry, or for your reports. You can carry them around to what different reports that you're looking at in Google Analytics, but not change your data. You can also compare segments, so that can be helpful in a variety of ways. You can share them with other users, either save them to your view, so they're just a part of the reporting tools available, or somebody can save them to their account. And you can apply them to different reports. And I want to show an example of that. But I think that segments really are valuable to folks who have limited time. If you spend a little time identifying some segments, then we don't have to try and interpret, well, we had, 100,000 page views last month, and we had 98,000 the month before. What does that mean? Or which of those visitors were doing something we wanted to? Using segments, we can get much more granular based on some things that are give us some level of specificity about these anonymous visitors. So let's take a look at what it takes to build one of these really quickly. I'm looking at an audience overview report here. So top level sessions and users and page views for for a web property. And up at the top here, I've got the little blue circle that says all users. And then next to it, I've got this add a segment box. So by default, we're viewing a segment in Google Analytics. It just happens to be everybody, all the users, all the data. But we can add a segment to any report using this mechanism. We can also create a new one. So that's what we'll do first. So when we click on that, we get a screen that looks like this. It'll show existing segments that you have. There's some built-in system segments, things like mobile devices, if you wanted to just view mobile across a bunch of different reports. We know there's a separate report for mobile built into Google Analytics. So you can see your existing segments. You can also create a new one. So we click our red button there. We can go ahead and build a new segment. And that'll give us this screen, where on the left we have a number of different criteria. Runs the gamut in terms of things that Google Analytics collects and lets you segment based on. And then you set some criteria. I like to use the conditions down here in the advanced section on the bottom, because you can do a lot of different things here. Most of them are pretty simple. And so it's kind of quick and easy way to build some useful segments. So if I select that, I get just a little bit different view. And what you provide here are just a handful of things. A name. So I'm going to create a segment based on a campaign. So I have visitors coming in to this email campaign about the virtual tour, and I want to segment and see just those visitors. So I give it a name. I could probably pick one more descriptive if I'm going to create many of these segments. But next, I select the campaign. So as the drop-down list here where campaign has all these different values for different Google Analytics dimensions. I'm going to choose the campaign. So the campaign name, and it contains virtual tour. You can get into regular expressions and multiple conditions and all kinds of things that are more complex here if you're techy enough and interested enough. And then when I select that, I get over on the right a summary of the users that match this. So I'm matching far less than 1% of all users with this segment, only 104 users, but there are 104 really specific users who I know something about because they came into the site from this virtual tour email newsletter. So once I create that segment and close out of there, it adds it to the report. So I was on that audience overview report. I'm still on that audience overview report. Now I have in the top left, the visitors to the campaign, and then I'm also viewing all users. So right now I'm comparing my segment to everybody, but I can remove all users and just view my segment if I want to. And the next screen I'll show you does that. But you can see that now I can look at the data for just the visitors to this campaign. They had 1,845 page views and 8.87 pages per session, and so on and so forth. Probably not that useful on the audience report, but then I might take that other places, like this mobile device report. So looking at the device categories for the visitors to this campaign, I can see who came in on desktop and mobile and tablet, and then what kind of time did they spend? How did they engage? And look at that down here in the report. And I could carry this segment around to any number of things to just evaluate what are these people doing? What are they converting on? What are the devices they're using? What content did they look at? And is it the stuff that I wanted them to look at when I endeavored to send them this email? And did they lead to some conversions? So there's a lot you can do with segments. You can create them quickly and easily. You can experiment with them. It's not like it's a permanent thing to create a segment. It's not as permanent as creating a view. So I encourage you to explore those. So
hey, Greg.
Yeah.
Hey, just before we move on, do you mind stopping your screen share and then restarting it? We're having a couple attendees note that there's just a little issue with so the slides are coming through a little blurry, and I think that's going to fix it right up.
Let's try that.
Perfect. Thanks. And I will definitely let you know if the issue doesn't resolve itself, but onward. Thanks.
Okay. So onward to some Google Analytics advice, just some quick takeaway things on these areas. Hopefully you've tinkered with them all, but for goals, tie these to marketing activities and look for opportunities to do that. And also maybe set value on goals. This is underutilized in higher education. All goals, all conversions have a value, a dollar value you could assign. And you could do some of this by determining, for example, for an RFI form, the value of an enrolled student. how many RFIs, for a segment or for a period resulted in enrolled students, and then calculate a value per, submit request for information form, and then assign that value to the goal. Now, when you go look at that goal, you can have a dollar value to really make, drill home the importance of, generating those sorts of leads. For campaigns, I mentioned this earlier, but just the planning that goes into tagging URLs and documenting that makes it a lot more useful. So I see a lot of Google Analytics accounts that have campaign data in them, but a lot of times the folks who are creating those campaigns aren't communicating about it, aren't documenting it, so that it's really useful for reporting. So the data's there, but it's not particularly useful data because there's no key to tell you what those campaigns are all about. And then with segments, experiment with those, even segments on a campaign like I just showed, that would let you take a look at marketing activities that are happening and then isolate those visitors on your website and see what else they're doing. I have some resources for you on Google Analytics. So there's a campaign tracking worksheet that Lunametrics created. It's a Google Doc. It's a great way to get started tracking your campaigns. And then some Google Analytics kind of standard stuff to get up to speed and fill gaps in what you need for Google Analytics in general. I'd like to spend a little time on Google Tag Manager and make sure we're all on the same page about how that works and how it fits into the toolbox. I see Tag Manager continuing to be adopted in higher education. I'd say the majority of the folks that I've been working with this year have either were already on it or are moving to it, as they work on their websites, relaunch websites. And so it's part of the landscape. But what is it doing for us? There's often confusion about this. So Tag Manager does not store any reporting data for us, record any data. It doesn't provide any reporting, so it's not where we go for reports. And it does not replace Google Analytics in any way. So it's not a data collection tool or a reporting tool, which makes it a more abstract concept. But it really does help with some other things around the other analytics tools you're using. So what it will help you do is remove tracking code from your web pages and in your CMS. So instead of install this Facebook pixel on these pages, install this Google Analytics code on these pages, this AdWords code, all of that code gets deployed and created in Tag Manager and then published to your website that way. So you're not touching your web pages over and over again. And we've probably all seen cases where things get added to websites, whether it's new pages or tracking code, nothing gets removed without significant effort. So this makes it, separates those things a little bit. You can implement advanced features of Google Analytics like event tracking, and I want to talk a little bit about that. And keeping tracking code in one place. So in this digital marketing landscape, it's not uncommon to have marketing communications, an advertising vendor, maybe multiple units on campus, doing different things that require tracking code and tags. And we don't want to do things in duplicate. And we do want to take advantage of what other people are doing. And it provides one place to do all that, so that when we're looking at what the website is tracking, we can understand who created it and when and why and so forth, because there's versioning and tracking of all the changes that you make in Tag Manager. So it helps with deploying and testing as well. There are lots of supported tags in Tag Manager for things that are built in that it understands how to do. So it makes it a little easier to deploy those. And I think it becomes non-technical for a number of these things, although you can certainly dig into some technical weeds with Tag Manager. So your universal analytics, Google Analytics tracking code, things like AdWords and DoubleClick, Crazy Egg, Hotjar, different tools that I see folks in higher ed using that require tracking code can all be done together. And virtually any kind of tag that isn't reflected with a built-in tag in Tag Manager can be done as a custom tag where you take that tracking code that it gives you and paste it in to Tag Manager and deploy it. So managing all this in one place is much better for maintenance and just coordinating efforts. So an example of what this looks like for AdWords, it really is as simple as this. You create this tag, you give it the conversion ID, so that's kind of the unique part of your tag with AdWords. You couple this with a trigger. So we've got a tag that says it's AdWords, here's the conversion ID, and a trigger that says here's what pages we want this on, based on the URL, or maybe we want it on all pages. And then you publish it out and it's good to go. So simple use case for a simple tag. I'll take a deeper dive here into event tracking, because Tag Manager can help us with event tracking as well. And that, of course, gives us data in Google Analytics around interactions that people are having with our website that aren't page views. So maybe they click on a call to action or an external link. Maybe they scroll a certain amount down the page. Maybe they're interacting with a program finder or some other feature that doesn't reload the page, but filters and changes the view of the data. So to enable event tracking, we configure tags, we configure triggers, and then we do some testing to make sure that it's all working. So I'll walk through the steps of this, and there are a lot of different flavors of this, but this is a great benefit of Tag Manager, and something to demystify a little bit if you're not doing it yet. So for event tracking, most of the time a tag is required for each event category. So if we have a category for file downloads, a category for outbound links, a category for form submissions, each one would be its own tag. And then the tag defines the category, action, and label. And you'll remember that those three things are the three pieces of data that show up in Google Analytics under event tracking, so that we can view the category, action, and label. We can create goals based on those. So it's important to be, thoughtful about how you name those, and then know what they mean, so you can use them in other ways. You can also use variables, and it's not uncommon to use at least some variables for event tracking. Some of these are built-in variables that Google Analytics or Google Tag Manager makes available to you. For example, when you click on a link, what's the URL of the link that you clicked on? Is it internal or external? Or what was the text of the link that was clicked on? Whether it was a button or inline, etc. And so those variables can be used to plug data into the Google Analytics as well. Then we'll have triggers, which are critical to tell Tag Manager when we want this tag to fire, when we want it to record this data. It can be helpful to have some knowledge of the HTML structure for elements in event tracking, so that you can target the particular element that you want. So a good example of that is a call to action button. You might have multiple buttons that look similar on a website, and they're essentially just links with labels and some design to them. But certain calls to action might, correspond to something that you're more interested in than others. And so getting into the HTML structure about where the button lives, or something particular about the code that's used to display it on the page, will help isolate it. So that's something where sometimes there's a little technical help to get those things set up. And then you can preview and debug, which are essential to verifying that event tracking is set up correctly. So I want to walk through the screens and the steps for event tracking to just show what this is all about at a high level. The first thing you do is create an event tracking tag. There's a little bit more to this than the AdWords tag I showed earlier. It's a universal analytics tag. The type is event. So it's event tracking versus a page view, which is what your regular Google Analytics is. And then you define your category, your action, and label. And you can see if the screen is showing up with the crispness required, or when you look at these slides later, the action and label use variable names in this case. So those things are created in the tag. The next thing we create is a trigger that says, well, when do we fire this tag? Well, if we're tracking outbound links, which is what this example is doing, then we only want to use this on clicks and on links, and only on particular links. So for the case of mStoner.com, for our website, we only want to track an external link when it goes to a domain other than that doesn't contain mStoner.com, right? If mStoner.com is in there, it's one of our pages, and if it's not, it's somewhere else. Sometimes examples, internal and external can get a little more complex than that when you have different subdomains, but there's power within these triggers to target those things. And then finally, after we add this trigger and tell Tag Manager when to deploy this tag, we can debug it. And the steps to do that are to go into Tag Manager, open up another tab or another window in your browser, and then just go to the page where you want this tag to fire. At the bottom of the page, you'll get this little Google Tag Manager frame that loads at the bottom. and it'll show you the tags that fired on the page. And as you interact with the page, it'll show you tags that fire. So in this case, I interacted with an external link, and it shows me tags that fired on that event. And so I can see that this tag I just created and this trigger are working, but also make sure it's not working or it's not firing in other instances, right? So I would want to click on a link that is an mstoner.com link in this case to make sure it doesn't fire there. And then the last bit of quality assurance on this is to test it in Google Analytics. So I use the real-time reports in Google Analytics, maybe isolate the event category, action and label that you're trying to deploy. I sometimes do it based on geography. Since I work remotely, I can then isolate that I'm the one doing this and see my action that I made with my event. So that's event tracking using Tag Manager, which is one of the things that makes it appealing. But I think there's still value in managing tracking code and sharing. And Tag Manager, I think, is here to stay as well. So for folks who are thinking about it, is it worth the investment? Is it too complex a tool? Hopefully I've given you a flavor for some of those things. And then some resources here. The blog here goes as deep as you want to go into Tag Manager. Simo Hava is an expert in Tag Manager. Lunametrics has recipes for Tag Manager that you can import that will give you tags and variables and triggers to do certain types of tracking so that you don't have to invent it yourself or go follow a blog post or something like that to do it. You can just import things and set the settings to your Google Analytics account, test it out and go. So I recommend checking those out. And then, of course, there's some information from Google about their Tag Manager training options online. Another topic I want to talk about today is A/B testing. It's come up a couple of times today as well. And this is something I see fewer people doing, but I'm curious about it. So Mallory's going to launch a poll about how many people do A/B testing on their website specifically. And I'm curious to see what those results are. But I want to do just a brief overview of this, talk a little bit about the tools, an example of doing this, or really a couple examples, and then some resources for this. Because this is another way that analytics are starting to come into our website. They're separate from Google Analytics in some cases, and it's data that we can use to help us with digital marketing. And there are a few different ways that manifests. For testing tools, there are lots of these. And certainly I haven't used all of them or have expertise in all of them. But I wanted to isolate a few and give a little context for those. So some tools that are good for starting out, that are lower cost or free and kind of better for ease of use for website A/B testing are Google Optimize, which is Google's tool, obviously, Optimizely, and Crazy Egg, which I know there are folks in higher ed that use Crazy Egg for other things already. And then on the higher end, you've got things like Visual Website Optimizer, HubSpot, which has come up some different times today. I know some folks use HubSpot for different things, Convert, and even some other things that are focused on landing page creation or are combined with other tools. So there are multiple ways to do this. There isn't a right way. I think it's helpful to, if you're going to experiment with this, to start with something that's simple, that's lower cost, that you can have some success with, rather than invest in a real heavy lift. So Mallory reports that about 40% of folks attending are doing A/B testing today, which is great. About 60% haven't done that yet. So let's take a spin through some of these examples, and it'll give you both groups some things to kind of compare with and learn from. So I selected a simple example here that we worked with Johnson & Wales University on earlier this year. So they launched their website in the summer of 2017. And as any website redesign there are decisions that are made about content and information architecture and design that, sometimes, we think about changing later or changing after launch, or we just want to know how those performed. And we had a handful of those things. So some of the things that we tested with JWU were topic navigation labels, which is an example I'll show you here next. The location of global calls to action, where those are positioned on the page. The hero image, caption, and link. So the big heroes that appear on some of their landing pages. And then their call to action to request information on program pages were among the things that we tested. So we deployed these tests at different times. It took a few days to deploy each test. We did some planning in advance and some results at the end. So you can see what kind of this process looked like for something really lightweight. And this is the topic navigation labels. So one of the debates with the primary navigation on the website was how to showcase some new storytelling resources that JWU put into their CMS templates and then into the design to tell JWU stories. And that section of the site was called Unique to JWU. So along with some of the usual suspects in the primary nav, academics, admissions and aid about JWU, there's this Unique to JWU link. And we thought about changing that to JWU stories because this really is a storytelling device, and we want to drive some engagement and tell these JWU stories. So we wanted to measure, change that out, measure the difference in clicks and see if that makes a difference in the amount of engagement we get. And we targeted new visitors to the site for this because we figured that this isn't content that internal audiences are consuming, and we wanted to take them out of our results. So after conducting this test, it took a couple of days, we were surprised to learn that there was a significant decrease of 81% in traffic, clicks through that link. Now that link is part of the global nav that appears across the site. So people were clicking on that from different places. But it was a significant decrease. And so that gave us a pretty simple solution that we weren't going to make that change. And that's kind of a good lesson for some of what you find with A/B testing. There's kind of this holy grail of, okay, we changed the color of a button and now our conversions increased 50%. But that doesn't happen as often. Sometimes you get a result like this where we think we're going to make a change and it turns out what we have is better. And so we're really just confirming something that's already existing, or maybe leading to another test that, okay, changing that didn't work. Is there a different change that would work or be better? I'm not sure. In this case, there is. We didn't take a second action with it. We left it alone. But there are also cases where you're going to have tests that are inconclusive. So you could run the test, run it for a period of time, and it just doesn't result in any difference. And so you should be prepared for that possibility as well. Another example of A/B testing that James talked about in his session earlier is when folks do this with digital advertising. So he gave an example of the apply ads that were being deployed. And then there were a couple others that were done similarly for request information and schedule a visit. And you remember that he pointed out this cost per conversion as being the number that led to a decision about which advertisement was more successful. And so the lesson here that James touched on is that sometimes there's more than meets the eye in terms of what success is. And I also wanted to emphasize that you can do this A/B testing and gather this data in different ways. So this data we're looking at isn't coming from Google Analytics. And likewise for the earlier piece, it's coming, the JWU testing was done with Optimizely. So here's a case where we've got these different sources of data, and we may need to look outside of Google Analytics for things that can really help us make actionable choices in digital marketing and on our websites. So resources for A/B testing. There's a really good webinar that Google did with the company Nest that makes those thermostats, the Nest thermostats, and they really have a testing culture around their website. So everything gets tested, and that's part of the ongoing process. And so I think that was really fascinating to think about. The business there is a little different than higher education, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to use A/B testing in a lightweight way to get some value and get some things out of analytics. And it's not really about Google Analytics, right? It's about doing things either with some of your digital marketing efforts, whether it's email or ads or on the website. And there are really good tools now to do those things that don't require a real heavy lift. You can do it with a small team and a small budget. Optimizely, which is one of those testing tools, has a really good blog. So whether you use Optimizely or not, they have some good information about A/B testing there. And then the last link is to some case studies of A/B testing that are segmented by vertical. So there are some in education. They don't all correspond to the types of use cases I think many of us have in this audience. But it's interesting to look at the types of things other people test and what sort of results they get if you're thinking about doing A/B testing on your website. Behave used to be a site called Which Test One, which some of you may have heard of. But here's a case study of the A/B test. Which one? Take a guess at which one was more successful, and then they share the results with you. So it's kind of fun to explore and plant the seed for some ideas. The last topic I want to cover today is around dashboards and reporting. And this has been a pain point that I've seen in using analytics, in particular Google Analytics, for a while. And so I wanted to show some examples of some ways to get past this with Google Data Studio. So Google Data Studio is a relatively new tool from Google. It's free. Google released they initially launched it with a limit of 5 reports, which was removed earlier in 2017. So it's become a viable tool to experiment with. And I want to show you a few examples of that and give you some resources and help you get started with that if you haven't. Going back to dashboards, I'm guessing that folks have either experimented with or seen a Google Analytics dashboard. And the universal conclusion that I've seen from folks is that they aren't real effective. They fall a little bit flat. They don't really speak to leadership. They aren't super actionable, and they really aren't even very good eye candy, when it comes to dashboards, charts, and graphs. So it's just not the right tool. And Google in some ways has agreed because they've given us Google Data Studio. Data also comes from multiple sources. We've talked about that a number of times today. So it's not just Google Analytics. So even if the dashboards in Google Analytics were great, increasingly that's not helping us tell the full story. The best reports that I've seen people creating, for the most part, have come from Excel or PowerPoint, where people are taking data out of Google Analytics, maybe out of other places, putting it together in a more visual way with some context, some description, some recommendations, some analysis, something that tells us what this data means. It's not just some charts and graphs and numbers. And so the bottom line is that those things matter, and having a tool and a process to help get to that is I think where we all need to head. So that leads us to Google Data Studio. And the report we're looking at on the screen is one that we worked on with Mills College out in Oakland, California. They relaunched their website over the summer. And so there are a host of things that they're interested in content and information architecture and conversions and tracking interactions on the pages. They've got a new program finder. They want to validate some assumptions, learn from it, and kind of report on the performance of the website. So they've put together a multiple page Data Studio report. This is just one of those pages, but I wanted to show it as an example of how we can combine charts and graphs, different formatting, because you can add images and brand things a little bit, which is a challenge to do in Google Analytics dashboards, and even combine multiple data sources. So for this report, we've got some explanation of what this is. This is scroll tracking. So these top level landing pages, we're using Google Tag Manager to deploy event tracking code to see how far people scroll. And because this new design is very modular and allows for longer pages, Mills is interested in how many people see some of that lower content on the page. So page views are great. How many people saw some things that are maybe below 50% of the way down scrolling on the page, and that influences some content decisions and helps evaluate performance. One of the challenges we had with this was how to pull in this data, because we wanted to do a calculation. So in this particular report, we're actually using a Google Sheet with the Google Analytics add-on to pull in Google Analytics data so that we can do the calculation to get the percentage, of page views of this page and then visitors who scrolled 50% or more. And so we pull those things together to get that number you see here. Another example of this Shannon talked about a little bit earlier in our work with Bowdoin College in their storytelling effort. So they went through this process that Shannon described to do a collaborative long form story and set goals for how it was going to perform, including some things coming from Google Analytics and social. And then use Google Data Studio to pull those things together. So this is an early draft of that report. So here we're combining Google Tag Manager for the tracking, Google Analytics, and Google Data Studio, like a lot of these different tools in the toolbox to help report on this storytelling initiative. Another example, and this is one you can take with you, is this Google Analytics dashboard. This is a Lunametrics dashboard that's created in Google Data Studio. You can make a copy of it, connect your Google Analytics data, your account as a data source, and then inherit, the visual tools that they have here, including some filters. So one idea for this is that it may be a way to deploy Google Analytics data to some of your stakeholders who want the data, but find Google Analytics itself a little overwhelming, or you don't want to create a view for them, or you don't want to have them in the system. They can have access to filter and look at a lot of the data pertaining to their part of the site. And you could expand this. This is one page. You can make a multiple page report or modify this as you see fit. So I've got a link to this in the resources and encourage you to check it out. Editing in Data Studio is, I think, a lot what you would expect. It's sort of a Google Docs type of environment. It's drag and drop. It's easier to do, I think, than Google Analytics dashboards are. It's something I've seen some clients adopt and do themselves. So Bowdoin was able to use it. Mills is using it to do some things internally without huge teams or dedicated resources, or a lot of training, frankly, because there's just some limited resources on Data Studio. So this is something I think is a great carry forward. And for 2018, I'm excited to see what higher ed does with Data Studio. It's got a low learning curve. It has the ability to plug in all the data that you use in Google Analytics and Google Search Console right into it. But then you can connect any number of different data sources, spreadsheets. You could export data from CRM or other systems and put a report on them on the same page, charts and graphs next to each other with other context, with other insight, to really make dashboards kind of meet the promise of what we intend them to be. And it's free, so the price is right as well. So I encourage you to check that out. Finally, I've got some resources here for you. That Lunametrics starter template that I mentioned, there's a blog post about that with the details on how you can go out and get that into your own Google Data Studio account. And then some video tutorials and information about the product. Since it's relatively new, it's evolving. It doesn't have the longevity or the depth of information about it that things like Tag Manager and Google Analytics have. So with that, we're ready to do a little Q&A, and I'll invite Mallory to come back in. And
awesome. Thanks, Greg. That was great. I really appreciated your comments on the Google Data Studio. It's not something I've personally used as a marketer yet, and sounds really interesting. So thanks for showing that, and thanks for leading this really important presentation. We do have a few questions for you. We'll start here. So Greg, you gave us a great overview of what Google's event tracking is, but Michael's curious, how exactly does Google define an event? Can you give us some insight on that?
So I don't know the technical definition to rattle off, but an event is really, it can be anything that you harness with that event tracking code and assign a category, action, and label to. So it can be scrolling down a page. It can be clicking on a link, that goes somewhere else. It can be clicking on a link or a button or a tab or an accordion within a page. So I like to think of it as an interaction within a page, or an interaction that isn't a page view. And it's sort of the beauty and the curse of it in a way that it can be a lot of different things. And that's why being intentional about how you label things in your reports is helpful, to know that, okay, this is a click on an accordion. And so it sort of reflects a visitor interest in additional content that was on a page, but it didn't generate another page view. And it can also extend the session, right? So if you click on the visitor comes to one page and does a bunch of events, that they may have only viewed one page on your site, but they interacted multiple times, if that makes sense.
Interesting, that does. Thank you. And as a follow-up, one of our institutions is curious if success around event tracking is ever dependent on a user actually logging into a page.
No, you can use event tracking. I mean, if we're talking about like a username and password login, I mean, we can use event tracking for any number of things that anonymous visitors would do on the site, for sure.
Great. So Amber asked a great question a little while back, and she and I were going back and forth in the chat room around this. So I'll bring you up to speed. She was curious if there's any disadvantages to setting up tracking links in other tools like Bitly or HubSpot instead of using Google's URL builder. And something that I shared as a HubSpot user is if you're properly using HubSpot's campaigns and attaching them to all your landing pages and emails, and you've also set HubSpot up to be connected to your Google Analytics, then you're kind of in the clear. Like that HubSpot tool is allowing you to bypass Google's URL builder, and all that really great data and measurement still gets nicely brought into Google Analytics. But my 2 cents on Bitly was that it's a great kind of end place that I would always recommend using Google's URL builder first, because that's going to tie into your campaign reporting within Google Analytics. But that Bitly link is really great if you need to shorten the link so it's more readable, or if there's just some basic measurements around tracking that you might want to share and be able to see really quickly. So that was my 2 cents. Greg, what would you add to that? Or, I mean, feel free to refute everything I just said.
No, I'm with you. I think like the key takeaway I'd summarize is that if you're using something like Bitly to shorten URLs, you have the opportunity to shorten a Google Analytics campaign tagged URL to something shorter. And people also do that with redirects on the web server, where you've got maybe a vanity URL that's something.edu/landing page. And then it can redirect to a deeper page or somewhere else that includes campaign tagged URLs that actually are getting applied by the web server doing the redirect. So there are other ways you can kind of package up those campaign URLs in conjunction with other technologies, whether it's Bitly or a redirect or what Mallory described with HubSpot. And that's a great way to kind of get those URLs in the spots they need to be without having to deal with something kind of cumbersome and long.
Awesome. Thank you. Jacob is curious if you see value in a university kind of designating one specific person on their marketing team to be responsible for tracking data and analytics.
I do. And increasingly, I think it's important to do that, to have someone who just knows everything that's going on. And I think of analytics as kind of multidisciplinary. So sometimes you need a technical resource, a web developer to help us set up and tag manager in your CMS. Certainly marketers need to be involved and communicators. So it helps to have somebody who knows all those pieces. But in a lot of ways, they're, like a project manager would be. They don't need to know how to complete every task, but just know what the moving parts are, that we've got these campaigns going on, we have these external tools, we have this Google Analytics account, and we're making sure that other people aren't spinning up other accounts, and that we're coordinating on those efforts. But it doesn't mean that that person does all of that stuff, right? Because there's rarely a person whose full-time job is devoted to that.